Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. Good morning, friends. And I realize it's January 9th. If you're hearing this on a Monday, I'm recording this on Sunday, January 8th. But Happy New Year one more time. It still feels like we're just kicking off 2023 and very, very excited about this year for a lot of reasons, including a lot of things we have planned for you on our podcast. But I want to start by sharing an email that we received a few weeks ago now. And the email, I'm just paraphrasing it, but it went something like this. I really enjoyed that interview with Gus Resendez on athletic recruiting. At the end of the interview, this is part one she's referring to, you said part two will be up shortly. So I went on to episode 285, because that first part one was 284, and I listened to the whole episode in its entirety. And there was nothing there about Gus Resendez part two on athletics. So what happened? You told us it'd be part two. And I said to myself, oh, snap. I realized we've done a poor job explaining sort of how our sequencing works. So what we do is we keep all of our Monday interviews in one track. So if we have a part one, part two, part three on Monday, like we're about to start a brand new interview today, it will go on 290, 292, 294 consecutively on Mondays. And we keep Monday interviews in the Monday track, Thursday interviews in the Thursday track. So when we say come back, we're referring to come back on Monday or come back on Thursday. And we partly do that because one of the things about the Monday interviews is I can run a 40-minute straight interview segment like we will do on 294 when Hillary and I discuss FERPA. That's a 40-minute interview. I would never go 40 straight minutes on a Thursday because we also have a question from a listener. And we also have a college spotlight, and we also have it in the news. So that's just kind of why we keep them separate. Another listener, shout out to Michelle, college counselor in Washington State. She gave a really good suggestion this week, which was in the show notes, I think you should have a little bit of a guide on how to listen to your podcast. It could just be in the show notes. And I think that's an excellent idea. So look for us to get that up in the next 4 weeks so that you cannot be so confused. All right, so last week I indicated I was going to do another series recap, looking back on the year, looking ahead to the year, big issues in higher ed. But what I decided to do is make that an in the news because there's really 7 points, and I wouldn't do it justice in this Monday segment. So Dave and I will be discussing big issues in higher ed for 2023. And you regular listeners know Dave is in our rotation of co-hosts, and Dave will be he's up on the last week of every month. So you can look for that at the end of January. All right, I just want to briefly touch on about a half a dozen developments in higher ed. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Varsity Blues scandal. Now, almost every single week in the last couple of years, I could have come on here and shared something with you about Varsity Blues. There's something in the news every week. But I've stayed away from it because it just felt too sort of National Enquirer-ish, for lack of a better word. Just too titillating in a non-educational, informative way. Gossipy maybe is a better word. So, but this is pretty significant news. So, and the news is that the mastermind behind the Varsity Blues scandal, Rick Singer, has been sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. That happened this week. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure all our listeners do, but there could be a few that don't. Singer was involved in a massive scandal where he collected $25 million from clients, charging some over $1 million and most into the hundreds of thousands of dollars to promise that he could get people into the college of their choice through what he called the side door. And he would argue the front door is the way most people try to get in, and it's incredibly difficult with the low admission rates. So it's a crapshoot at the most selective schools. And then you also have, a backdoor approach, which is a development gift, but a lot of times that's going to be an 8-figure gift. And most people don't have that kind of money. So for a fraction of that price, he'd get you in through the side door. And it involved a combination of bribing and working with his test prep guy who would go in and pretend they were your kid and ace the test. And then he also worked at a bribery scheme with coaches who would fake that the person applying was an athlete and get them through as a athletic recruit. So the government had actually sought a 6-year sentence for Singer, but he had been cooperating with authorities for the most part. And so he ended up getting 3.5 years. So that all went down in 2019, the start of 2019. We have many podcasts on it if you're interested in going back and listening about that. But Rick Singer, 3.5 years in prison. Now, the second thing I want to announce is, let me give you a bit of background on this one. So multiple times in the last 3 years, I have recommended a college to a student I was working with in the state of Florida. And I've had a parent say to me, we're not doing Florida. In fact, it happened to me 2 weeks ago. And the idea is I don't like the political climate there. I don't want my kid to be in that environment. And for the most part, I would try to push back and say that colleges are more liberal than the surrounding area. And they're kind of their own little echo chamber, with most faculty being pretty progressive and younger people being pretty progressive. So I wouldn't necessarily make the decision just off of the political climate of the larger state. That was my argument. But increasingly, there is evidence that people that are not looking for conservative indoctrination may need to be wary of certain states. And I say that because of some new things that Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida. So DeSantis has a lot of power in the Florida system because he basically can appoint members to the governing board for the public universities. And the new College of Florida, it's located in Sarasota. It's the Public Honors College for the state of Florida. It's a fantastic school that I really love. You get all the best of small classes and access to professors at public school prices rather than private school prices. But what DeSantis has done is he's just added 6 members to the 11-member governing board, including, for example, Christopher Rufo, conservative activist who passionately argues against critical race theory, Matthew Spalding, a dean from Michigan's Hillsdale College, which we've talked about before. And it really goes against the culture of the new College of Florida, which has traditionally been quite liberal, faculty and students. So here's a quote from the chief of staff for DeSantis, James Altmaier. "It is our hope that the new College of Florida will become Florida's classical college, more along the lines of a Hillsdale of the South." And he gave that quote to a very right-wing, some would argue racist publication called the Daily Caller. So this is just a number of actions that DeSantis has been taking to reshape higher education in Florida, including he's backing a law that prevents faculty from talking about certain topics related to race and gender. Now, that goes against a lot of things in free speech. Now, that particular law that DeSantis is backing, a federal judge has, at least for now, blocked it, saying that viewpoint diversity should be permitted. But that's some of what's going on in Florida. And so it's making me rethink whether or not, the political landscape in the national sense or in the state sense, I think is a legitimate factor to look at when you're thinking about schools. It's not like I never thought it was a non-factor. I just thought that people put too much emphasis on it before. And I'm starting to question that. And maybe they actually don't when you see some of the major changes that are occurring. Okay, anybody wondering what Hillary Clinton is up to? Well, guess what? If you are interested in international and public affairs, your student is, and you're at the Columbia University, you may have a new professor named Hillary Clinton. That's right. Hillary Clinton is joining Columbia University's faculty as professor in international and public affairs, just announced 3 days ago. Speaking of Columbia, it's forming a fascinating study because if you're a regular listener of our podcast, you know that they were caught gaming the rankings for U.S. News and World Report. And as a result of that, they were dropped from number 2 in all of undergraduate institutions in those bogus rankings, all the way to the lowest spot of any Ivy League school. They dropped all the way to 18th. Obviously completely arbitrary, but that's what they did. So they're actually going to form an interesting study if we look at Columbia over time, and that is how much do rankings impact applications. And the early evidence is right away in year 1, you can see an impact. So Columbia had 5,738 early decision applicants this year to the class of 2027 or high school class of 2023. Now, mind you, that is significantly more than they had in any class from 2024, which would be high school class 2020, previous to that. Almost every highly selective school experienced a significant spike in their application numbers for a number of reasons. Some of it was going test optional. Some of it was them making virtual programming much, much more available and accessible to people so you can just log in your computer and learn a lot of information. Some of it was a flight to safety in times of uncertainty. People thought maybe a brand name degree would help them more in times of uncertainty. So it's a confluence of all three of those factors. Anyway, Columbia had 5,738 ED applications, early decision, which our regular listeners will know you apply early, you get an early notification, but it is binding. You have to withdraw all your other applications. You cannot compare financial aid offers. You're committed to that school. Well, guess what? 2 years ago, they had 6,435. Last year, 6,305. They're down 700 applications. That might not seem like a lot, but that's a pretty big decrease. 9% decrease in 1 year. No other Ivy League school had a 9% decrease in 1 year. It's incredibly hard to not believe that's related to all the brouhaha of the ranking scandal. So interesting to watch and follow over the next 5 to 10 years and see if this trend continues. All right, speaking of U.S. News and World Report, we have covered this pretty extensively on here. Massive outbreak in law schools that have said they will not participate in the U.S. News and World Report's rankings. In fact, I haven't even shared all the schools. I started sharing them and the list got to 8, then 9, then 10, then 11. It just kept growing. Maybe if you're interested, I'll come back and I'll list all the schools that said go pound sand, we're not participating. List got quite long. So U.S. News has decided to tweak its law school ranking formula in response to the intense criticism that more than a dozen of these prominent schools verbalized. And the biggest area that they're looking at making the revision has to do with giving more weight to certain steps schools take to promote public service careers and less weight to how they judge academics and lawyers' perceived reputation of the schools. But as soon as I read this is an article that came out this week in the Washington Post. As soon as I read this, I said to myself, there's no way they're going to back off. Because one, that's only one of their complaints. And two, fundamentally, they don't believe an outside organization that doesn't even understand how a law school works can dictate to them what a quality school is. They quite honestly know more about producing a quality law school than a bunch of editors and journalists at the U.S. News. And so, not surprisingly, U.S. News made a big brouhaha out of it. They said we had conversations with more than 100 deans and representative law schools, and we formed a leadership group in an attempt to address this issue. And basically, the response from the deans so far is thank you, we appreciate it, and we still will not be participating. So there's a big showdown here. And what most people are waiting to see is, does it trickle over to the undergraduate rankings? Most people feel like if it is going to trickle over to the undergraduate rankings, there's going to be a boycott. That would not happen now. The timing would not be now. So we're going to have to wait a few months to see. And we'll update you if there's any major developments here. And the last thing, and I am excited about this, shout out to Sarah, college counselor in Northern California, because she tipped me off on this. You may have heard us mention this, or you may know from your own experience that when you complete the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, you can only list 10 schools at a time. Very antiquated in a day when many people apply to more than 10. So every year, multiple times I get the question, what do I do? It only lets me apply to 10. And I had to walk people through the process of how you wait till they've got the ISAR. See, when you've got your SAR, your student aid report, then the school's gotten the ISAR from the Department of Education, and you can delete them and then add new schools, and they still have your information. Well, guess what? No more of that. They have decided to do what the Comment app does and make a cap of 20 instead of 10. So this should solve everybody's problem. There's really hard to justify applying to more than 20 schools. I know some people do it. You can whittle your list down lower than that in 99.9% of circumstances. I mean, I've been on record as saying there's not a perfect number. Don't let anybody tell you there is. I really find a hard time believing somebody needs to apply to more than 20 colleges. I have yet to be sold on that. Do more research, and you can whittle your list down to a lower number than that.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
All right, friends, we have a brand new interview, and it's one I'm really excited with. It's with Hillary Dickman. She's the Assistant Director of Admissions at Colorado College. She's somebody who listens to every single episode, probably that we've ever had, and she just uses it as her own professional development. She uses it to stay apprised on what's going on, what are people talking about in the world of higher ed. And what I like is she gives feedback to me oftentimes, either things that she really appreciates us emphasizing because, she's on the other side, and she says, boy, it sure would be helpful if people would understand what you're saying. And occasionally she'll say, Mark, I haven't heard you talk about this topic, and I think really would be helpful for your listeners. So just like Daryl at University of Delaware, another admission officer who listens regularly, I find their feedback invaluable to us. She's sharp as a whip. She's very insightful. And we're going to take on 3 topics over the next 3 weeks. So 3 complete, distinct, and separate interviews. So in this first week, we'll be talking about something that quite a few people have sent in, actually. You could really say Hillary's taking the question from a listener, because quite a few people have sent in and asked us, how is early decision 1 different from early decision 2? And so that's our topic for this week. And then next week, we'll talk about why is it so hard to get into a highly selective school these days, a unique approach to figuring out how many spots are available for you. And then the final segment will be FERPA. But for now, it's all about early decision 1 versus early decision 2. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm really excited today. I'm here with Hillary Dickman from Colorado College. And Hillary and I have been talking about doing this for a while. So welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Hillary.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and Hillary's been a long-time listener. In fact, we even met through her listening to the podcast. So it's been great to have somebody in admissions giving me feedback all the time on different things from an admissions standpoint. But why don't you just start and give a little bit of an intro about yourself, Hillary, and then we'll sort of introduce our topics.
Sure. Yeah. When we first met, I wasn't in admissions yet.
I know.
I actually started out in higher ed teaching. So I spent about, 7 or 8 years, I think, teaching at University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, teaching intercultural communication and interpersonal communication. Before that, I taught at University of Cincinnati, and then I taught all the way through my master's program at Miami University in Ohio. And then after I got a little tired of being in the classroom. And so I wanted to take some time off. I did a little bit of work in the nonprofit world, most recently working for a nonprofit that serves single moms facing homelessness. And then COVID hit. And so sort of nonprofit funding was challenging, and I decided that it might be a good time to go back to higher ed, but doing something different. And I'd been listening to you for a while, and both my girls were in high school, and I had always been really fascinated by admissions. Like when I was in high school, I used to read the Lisa Birnbach book. Do you remember that book?
I remember her name, but I don't
Yeah,
remember the
she
book.
had this book that it was a little bit like if you in the 90s loved reading 17 magazine, you would probably love the Lisa Birnbach Guide to College Admissions because it was very like open and honest and told you really what the reputation of every school was. And I think I read every page of that book, and it was super interesting to me to understand sort of the different personalities that different colleges have. And that had been in the back of my mind for a while, that college admissions has always been fascinating to me. We on road trips would hit every college town everywhere we went. And so it just seemed like a good fit. So Colorado College is really close to where I live, and I really love the liberal arts. And so I decided to apply and see what would happen. And I started out in a temporary admission position, working in place of someone who was out on maternity leave. And then they decided to keep me around. And I'm so glad they did because it is just as fascinating and fun as I thought it would be. And I love the way it challenges me and makes me think really critically pretty much every day.
You know, you're giving people a lot of hope. We get all these emails from people that say, I want to be in admissions or I want to do college counseling. How do I do it?
Okay,
now they're hearing a real live story.
Right. Let me temper that for you. I had to apply 5 times.
See,
and like when I was working at UCCS and decided I didn't want to be in the classroom anymore, I applied for an admission position there and did not get it. That was like 10 years ago. So it took a while. It is hard. Admissions offices don't like to hire people who don't have admissions experience. And so I think I just got lucky by finding a temporary position where they could sort of test me out. And it's turned out to be a great fit. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to jump into at, when you're in your 40s.
Well, it's interesting you say that because particularly when I transitioned to boarding school admissions, I mostly got that job because I was super volunteer in there.
Yeah.
I was doing everything. I was following up with prospects, and I wasn't doing info sessions, but it was really my volunteerism that led them to seeing my skill set. And then they said to me, when we have an opening, we're going to be making you an offer. So I'm saying that only for people out there. Like, one good way to get your foot in the door is to volunteer and be super volunteer. Yeah. And then sometimes when an opening occurs, if your skill set matches the need, I tell students that too, and parents, everything. And a lot of people get their jobs that way.
Yeah. I could see that in the CBO space, especially like my sister-in-law volunteers for CBO, helping students with their applications, helping under-resourced students with their applications. And after a few years of that kind of experience, then you could pivot, I think, into if you wanted to work in an admissions office. But putting in the time that way, I think, is a really good way to sort of move into the admissions space.
And I agree. It's much easier to do that in a CBO world than it is to do it in an admissions job. Now, I'd had a year of admissions. It was 10 years before. I was on the college side. And they actually liked my sales background too, because they said that's recruiting.
Yeah,
and you got to go out on the road. Yeah, and territory management and all of that. So it was a combination of the year of college I had, even though it was a decade ago, coupled with the recruitment. But you're right. Just getting into a college admission job, especially at a selective school, without admission experience, very difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Now, you also had higher ed experience, which I'm sure didn't hurt. You know what I mean? Question for you about that. How do you feel being in the classroom impacts you at all from an admission standpoint? Do you see any correlation? Is there anything you take away from like envisioning someone what would be like in the classroom setting? Or
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps me in my role now that I took from being in the classroom setting, especially being at University of Cincinnati and then at UCCS, with those two schools, I had quite a few non-traditional students. Especially at UCCS, I had a lot of students who were coming straight out of the military. or students who had taken quite a bit of time off before coming back. And I also had 18-year-olds fresh out of college. And so I could see the difference between students who had a little more maturity and who were paying for college themselves and kind of the seriousness with which they took their college education. And so now when I'm reading files and I see a student who's taken a year or two off, or a student who just has a little bit more, reads a little bit more like they're more mature, that tells me that I loved those students when I was teaching them. And that tells me, like, rather than thinking, oh, I don't know, this is sort of a non-traditional student, I'm not sure how they would fit in, I think about the ways that they would benefit the classroom. So it's actually been really nice to have that lens to use when I'm reading applications.
Awesome. So Hillary and I are going to talk about a few different topics over the next few weeks. And our regular listeners, you know that Julia and Susan and I, we can talk and talk and talk. You see what's on the air, but off the air. Hillary and I have been known to have a couple of those good conversations as well. And one of them we had to do with early decision 1 versus early decision 2. And that's a topic that quite a few listeners have sent questions in on. So I'm just going to actually start with referencing a conversation that we had over the summer, Hillary, and then I'll follow up with a few other points about ED1 versus ED2. We were having a conversation about why is it that colleges don't share their ED2 acceptance rates. It's a common question that we get from listeners, or I get with working with students. Some schools do, but it's kind of rare. And normally it might be like at a counselor breakfast or something. Share what your thoughts are, because you have some pretty strong thoughts on that. And why don't you share what you want, what you shared with me, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah. So we at CC, like most other schools that I have seen, we compile all of our ED admit rates together. So we have an ED1 November 1st and ED2 January 15th. And they are probably different admit rates. Probably the earlier one looks on paper to be more generous than the second early decision round. And the reason why we put those together instead of publishing two separate rates is because we use the same metrics for evaluating students for both of those. And the difference in the early decision rates between 1 and 2 can really be chalked up to the strength of the application pool, the applicant pool. So ED1 tends to be a stronger group of students. And so when we're comparing them, we have sort of a rubric that we use, right, for evaluating students. And when we're comparing them to that rubric, they tend to compare more favorably in ED1. Those are students who have maybe had better counseling, who they might be more privileged students, that they're able to get their stuff together that early. But they also this is their first shot, right? And so students who are strong and have been counseled to apply to the right sort of level of selectivity in that first round. Those are the students that we see in the first round. The second round tends to be students who are a little, sometimes behind the ball, or really overshot it on their first ED application. They weren't admitted during their first ED application, and they think, all right, well, I got one more chance at this, and they overshoot it again. And lots of the sort of strongest students, I guess, have already been plucked up during ED1. And so ED2 just tends to be not as strong of a pool. And that's a lot of nuance to try to dig into. Like if we were to try to explain that during an info session, we try to keep our info sessions to between half an hour and 45 minutes. Like that would just open a giant can of worms. It'd be a lot of questions to answer, a lot of trying to help people understand why that is, when the reality is that it really doesn't make a difference for students because we're using the same metrics for figuring out which students are going to be the best academic fit for our college. And it's sort of just more detail than they need. I understand the question. I think it's great that people are digging into that and trying to really figure out like what the best track is going to be for them, and if it makes sense to hold off on their application until ED2. From a strategic perspective, but like strategically speaking, the only difference really is that if you have stronger grades during your fall semester of senior year, then you're probably going to be a better ED2 applicant than you would have been during ED1. And you're going to be sort of an anomaly in that situation, because generally what we see is just a weaker pool.
Yeah, and you've hit on a number of things because I want to go over various reasons over the years that admission officers have explained to me why the ED2 admit rate is higher than the ED1. I do not know of a school that has a higher admit rate ED2 than ED1. I don't know every school's data, but every single time someone's ever divulged it, it's always been a higher admit rate ED1. And I don't think Hillary and I have ever had an argument, but I remember one time we had a nice exchange, and I think you kind of brought me around to your view. I was taking the view, why can't you share your ED2 admit rate? We can handle it. And then Hillary brought the point up that it would take so long to explain that for people to understand it that you don't want it to dominate the info session. And so I thought that was a plausible explanation.
And I think a lot of people who come to info sessions are really like just in the beginning stages of understanding college admissions, and they may not even know what a binding round means. And so like to really dig into the weeds with them there, we can do that with counselors.
Yes.
We can do it with families who we've gotten to know well, and we know that they understand the different admission rounds. But for the general public, it's too much.
It makes a lot of sense. And I wasn't looking at it from that vantage point. I had more of a counselor worldview when I was coming at it with the question. So that's a point well taken. So I want to talk about multiple reasons why I've heard that ED2 tends to have a lower acceptance rate. You've touched on a couple. Let's just hit one of the ones that you identified right away, which is people sometimes are unrealistic in the ED2 round. They will shoot for a school ED1, they don't get in, and they don't realize that I need to adjust my selectivity and maybe significantly. And I hear that from a lot of schools. Anything else you want to say about that? Like, why do you think that happens? You just think it boils down to a person not getting good counseling, or maybe people doing it on their own and just trying to figure this out? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's not getting good counseling. I think it's not understanding the context of your maybe GPA, or you're not understanding what rigor really looks like. It's hard to compare your own transcript to other people's because you don't get to see other people's transcripts. And so you may think like, wow, I have straight A's in this really rigorous program, but your program may not actually even be the most rigorous at your school, much less compared to sort of the general public. So yeah, I think that there is just sort of a misunderstanding of how selective, highly selective college admissions is. And I don't think it helps that we as parents who are in our 40s or maybe 50s compare our kids' college searches to what ours were like. And well, when I applied, like, almost anyone could get into Colorado College. Well, now not almost anyone can get into Colorado College. It's a different landscape of highly selective admissions, and parents haven't necessarily wrapped their brains around what that looks like. And of course, we all think our kids are exceptional, and they are in lots of ways, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily the right fit for a highly selective admissions process.
I mean, you kind of hit a toxic brew, many points of that toxic brew all in one, and a lot of important points. And I feel sorry for parents. Like, and I think about it, like, how could we really expect them to know how much it's changed from when they applied, unless they're staying apprised of this?
Yeah.
Most things don't
tough.
change that much. You don't think whatever it is that you like. I like going to Disney. I went 20 years ago. I don't expect it to be 50 times better or whatever, But I mean, in general, you don't expect things to change that much. So that's one problem. You hit in another one. We all have a tendency to be a little biased about our own kids. And then you're in your own little echo chamber. You don't realize how big that world is out there.
Yeah.
I was thinking the other day, someone asked me the question, what is the biggest disconnect that you see between sort of how parents think or how kids think in reality? And I thought about this example. I think people think they're in a hot tub or a pool, and they're in an ocean.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you think you're in a hot tub, you think, oh, look, those are like 8 people I'm competing with in my school, or a pool, maybe 100 people. But in reality, it's the ocean. You can't even see it all the way to the other side, right? When we start talking
Yeah.
about international and everything. So I think you hit that point pretty well. What about this point? This is something I've heard a lot of people say. When it's in the first round, we need everybody. So every type of kid you need, as long as they're strong. And so you've got someone, they're enthusiastic. You need every kind of kid. And also you're fresh. I mean, I've been reading a lot of files for a while. So you're excited about kids and all these kids. And you're not really comparing somebody to a standard of a whole bunch of other kids. You're just comparing, we need every kind of kid. Whereas once you get into the second round, if you lock up a lot of really good kids, one admission officer said to me, now we're reading the regular pool at the same time we're reading the ED2 pool. And you're no longer just being compared to nobody but yourself. You're being compared to this vast glut of super talented kids. And so that's kind of a twofolder there, right? Because now, like, let's say we did let's say you did really, really well in your admits from a particular school or a particular state or a particular demographic. You're going to be a little bit more persnickety there and try to focus on other places where your institutional need maybe wasn't met through the early round. And now you're also combining that with comparing it to this large pool. Do you think that plays a role at all?
Yeah, I think that there's probably one at CC, there's probably one pool that hits especially hard, and that's the female demographic, especially the white female demographic, because there are so many strong white females out there, and we get a lot of them during early decision. And we also read early action at the same time of as early decision. So we don't have as much of the problem of like our minds sort of getting boggled between EA and ED1 versus regular action and ED2. We're sort of, that's pretty much the norm for us. But for sure, like we read a lot of strong white females during ED1 and early action, which makes it harder for those students to stand out or even have like space for them. We save space in ED2. There's just not quite as much left for that particular category of student.
You brought back a memory. I was crying on Hillary's shoulder proverbially a year or two ago when I was like, I sent you a really, really strong straight A kid. They didn't get in. But it was that demographic from a school that you get a ton of kids from. And it's just competitive.
Yeah, it is. It is competitive. And we do, I think, so it's really our VP and dean and director who do the work of making sure that we save space in the pool for the next 2 rounds after we get through ED1 and EA, but it does get harder. And especially, I don't think this is as bad with ED2, but when we get to regular action, like
Mm-hmm.
there's just not a lot of space left. Our admit rate drops precipitously, and that's really when we're looking at specific buckets of students who we need to really round out our class, because we're looking for a well-rounded class with talents in lots of different areas and lots of different experiences. And so regular action is really helpful for that. For us, it doesn't play as much of a round in ED2. I'm sure it does for schools who read differently from how we do.
Yeah, I think the point you made is really well taken. So you're not the only school that does this, but you're, I would say, more of an exception than the norm amongst selective schools by having an early action and an ED, both with a November 1. You're November 1, I think, right? November 15th?
Yep, November 1.
Yeah.
Yep.
Both with a November 1 date. So you're getting all, and then you guys also publish your RD admit rate.
Yes.
I remember seeing 3.9 or 3.3 or some crazy low
was,
number.
It was I think it might have been 3.1 this year, which
Yeah.
is just, I mean, really it's because we have no application fee, which I think is reasonable for a school who denies as many students as we do. But it also leads to sort of this deluge of applications during regular action. And so the numbers just get super out of whack. And we have an easier time yielding students who we see during early action. And so we're more likely to admit those students because we know they're more likely to come. And we want students who know us well, who've done the research, who are really excited about CC. And so early action plays a really key role in that for us.
Right. When you look at a lot of the schools that you overlap with, a lot of the similar, selective liberal arts schools, they have, ED and RD, or maybe ED1, ED2 and RD. And
Right.
so there's not that other round. So that's an important distinction that you're mentioning. And I'm glad you answered that question. Like, why is it that you would have a higher admit rate in early action versus regular? It's not necessarily the fact that you're putting so much emphasis on demonstrated interest. It's more that they're better prepared and they're stronger applicants from your experience. Is that correct?
Oh my gosh, yes. It's crazy when we read regular action and like we have students who the reason they want to come to CC is so they can play on the football team. And you're like, well, that's a bummer because we haven't had a football team since 1940, So we get like tons of applications like that. But then you also get the students who are, top of their class who applied REA to Yale or whatever, and they weren't admitted, and they really are strong applicants who are playing the field during regular action. And how could we not admit those students? So you get kind of both ends of that during regular action, but mostly just like so many applications.
No, this is helpful. Do you think it plays a role at all, sort of knowing that you were the first choice? Does that play a role subconsciously in
No.
anybody's mind? So you think that's a non-factor, knowing you're the first choice, and then maybe in ED2, maybe they applied to Dartmouth or Middlebury and they didn't get in, and now they're taking a shot at you. So that's, you think that's a non-factor. The
I think
whole
that's a
ego piece.
non-factor. Not anyone who I've talked to at CC
Okay.
anyway. I mean, when we see a student who we feel like is a good fit for CC and academically qualified and can come in through the ED2 round. And if we sometimes we do find out because we accidentally read something that a counselor accidentally left in a recommendation, or
Also,
that a
you know
teacher
where they
wrote or whatever.
applied first.
Yeah, so occasionally or you see that both parents went somewhere else and you think, oh, this student probably applied their ED1 and didn't get in. And then I feel mostly thankful that like, wow, this is our opportunity to have this amazing student that somebody else missed out on. And so maybe I have a different perspective on that. I love to be surprised. And
Sure.
so when I see a student who brings me that kind of surprise and I think like, ooh, I'm so glad that somebody else passed, like we get this gem that they missed out on, that's kind of more the feeling that I have.
I've only had one person ever say that to me. And
Really?
so, yeah, it's more like, hey, we were second, we could have been first. So it could have just been a one-off thing,
Yeah.
So
I feel
that's
so
probably not
strongly
the norm.
about the programs that CC brings to the table and what we have to offer students that I never feel like we're second to anyone because what we offer is distinctive from other colleges, and being at a liberal arts college in the mountains is different. And
Sure.
so no, I don't feel that way.
Awesome. Great. One other factor that explains why ED1 has a higher admit rate is because most of the athletes come in the early Decision 1 or ED1 round. Friends, this ends my first interview with Hillary Dickman. Next week, she'll be back to discuss a whole brand new topic. I hope you'll join us. Friends, on Thursday's episode, we have a hot topic that about 8 of you sent in to us to discuss. The article is entitled The Dirty Secrets of Elite College Admissions, or a second title, The Supreme Court is Set to Kill Affirmative Action, Just Not for Rich White Kids. That's by Evan Mandery, October 31st, 2022. If that name sounds familiar, I just did a recommended resource of Evan Mandery's book, Poison Ivy, and Vince is in the saddle to discuss that. For our question from a listener, it's Lisa and Susan doing part 2, the final part of their conversation about whether a student with chronic medical conditions should report it. How transparent should they be in their communication of their chronic medical condition to colleges? And for our interview, Lisa's joining me again to interview Brian Hodges, the Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Part 2 of 3, Understanding UIUC. And I'll be continuing giving you feedback on my recent trip to California where I visited 9 schools. Linda Depker will join me to discuss Occidental College, better known as Oxy. We hope you'll join us on Thursday. And remember, friends, college is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.